Hello everyone, and thanks for watching. If you're new to my channel, my name is Todd DeWald and I'm a wildlife photographer based in Connecticut. And today's video is going to be a little bit different than my usual videos. Usually I'm out in the middle of the forest photographing birds and other wildlife, but today I'm actually in my backyard because I'm going to be talking about my experiences in comparing the 600mm and the 400mm lenses for wildlife photography. So if you're like me, I've always wondered which lens was going to work best for my photography needs, and so I finally got my hands on both of them and I was able to compare them to really see the differences between the lens and see which one worked best for my photography. So if you're in the same boat and you're wondering which lens, if you're going in between the 600mm and the 400mm lenses and you're wondering which one works best for you or might work best for you, stick around and hopefully this video will help you decide which lens will work best for your needs based on the subjects that you photograph and the location that you are to photograph them. Now, this is not going to be a technical review. There's plenty of videos out there that kind of go through the specs of all the different lenses and go through these different charts and different graphical data. That's not me. I'm not a technical kind of guy. This is going to be more of a real-world, first-hand experience, me comparing the lenses and seeing which ones work best for my needs. So stick around if that's what you're looking for. So we're just going to start off with comparing the two lenses first off. So they're sitting on the table right next to me, so you can clearly see that the 400mm is a lot shorter than the 600mm. So that's pretty much the biggest difference right there off the bat. Other than that, they're pretty much an identical lens. They're both extremely sharp. They're fantastic lenses for wildlife photography. There is a little bit of a weight difference, but really in the real world, hands-on experience, the weight doesn't really make any difference. I will say, however, though, because the 400mm is shorter, the weight comes back closer to your body, so I actually found that it was easier to hand hold the 400mm compared to the 600mm. It was just an easier system to be able to move and operate, but the 600mm just takes some getting used to, and you still have the same maneuverability with it. Other differences, I mean, obviously these are both the Mark II versions of the lenses, so they're not the newest ones. However, obviously the 400mm, the largest aperture you can get with it is the f2.8, whereas the 400mm is f4. So the 400mm is going to let in twice as much light as the 600mm, which can be really important for low light situations. If you're like me, I'm usually out in the dense forest. It's usually, especially in the summertime when all the leaves are out, it gets very dark in the forest very quickly. So the extra light might be beneficial for you. Or if you're kind of out in the open prairie areas, or you're in the coastline where there's not that much low light isn't really a problem for you, the 600mm might be good for you there. Other differences, I mean, it's really not that much different. They both can use the Canon extender, so I have the 2x extender and the 1.4x extender. They both use those very well. Obviously with the 1.4 extender on the 400mm, you end up getting a 560mm equivalent with f4, and the 2x you end up getting an 800mm at f5.6, and then with the 600mm you end up getting a 840mm with the 1.4 extender at f5.6, and then you end up with a 1200mm at f8 with the 2x extender. So they both use those very well. Like I said, the weight is very comparable. The hand holdability is very comparable. The 400mm is definitely a little easier, but the 600mm is doable as well. I still use a tripod for both of them, especially for video. It's just easier to stabilize it with a tripod or a monopod, or using it on the ground. It just creates a much better stable platform for long-term shooting for videos and photos. So really the main difference to consider that I think between these two lenses is the subjects that you're going to be photographing and the style of photography that you want to do. If you want to do more of an open environmental shot, the 400mm I found is really useful for that. It gives you a little bit farther away from your subject, kind of creates more of a scene around the subject you're photographing, whereas a 600mm is more of a tight-in, close-up portrait lens, but you can still do environmental shots with it as well. So I mentioned the extenders and the use of the extenders. So my question had always been, is the 400mm with the extenders on pretty much the same as using a 600mm? is I've had the 600mm for about a year now. I've used it, I've loved it, the image quality is amazing, but I always had the question in my back of my mind, well, what if I just got the 400mm and then I basically had 3 lenses in one when I used the extenders? Because with the 1.4 extender, I get a 560mm, which is essentially, in my book, the same thing as a 600mm lens. And then I could just add on the 2x extender and get an 800mm lens, which is pretty much the same as the 600mm with the 1.4 extender on it. So I always had that question in the back of my mind of, would this be just a more versatile lens compared to a 600mm? And so I just really wanted to get my hands on the 400mm and test it out myself, because I was looking online, I was reading all sorts of articles, different YouTube videos, and I found like the videos and the articles just weren't that helpful. I didn't care about the technical jargon about everything, about the differences between the two lenses, so I just needed to get my hands on them and test them for myself, so that's what I did. Now, I went out into the woods, I hiked, like I said, I had the 600mm for about a year, so I knew how it operated, I knew how it worked. So I went out pretty much 2.5 weeks straight with the 400mm on my camera to really test it out. But I also did some tests here at home to figure out which lens was going to work best for me. I used paper targets essentially up on the wall, tripod, did the whole thing, did lens tests comparing the using with the extenders, comparing the two lenses side by side in Lightroom to see which one was sharper. And basically the bare lens of both of these is absolutely phenomenal. The 400 at 2.8 and the 600 at f4, it's amazingly sharp, best lens you're pretty much ever going to get. It's just amazing. Now, with the extenders added to the 400mm to make it equivalent to the 600mm lens, that's when things kind of went downhill a little bit. The image quality is still fantastic, but I found that with the 1.4 extender on the 400mm lens, the sharpness went down. So I was shooting at f4, 560mm with the 1.4 extender on this, and the sharpness was definitely not great when comparing to the bare 600mm at f4. Now, when I moved the aperture up to about f6.3, that seemed to be the happy spot for my lens, it basically made the same sharpness as the 600mm at f4. Now, with the 2x extender, I was able to, again, it was when I was photographing at 800mm at f5.6. The sharpness wasn't that great, it wasn't consistent, but when I moved it up to about f8, it had phenomenal sharpness, it was great. So, you kind of have to think what your uses are for the lens and how you're going to be using it to photograph your subject. So, basically, to get an equivalent for a 600mm lens with a 400mm, I would be shooting at with the extender on, and I'd be shooting pretty much at f6.3 compared to 600mm at f4, which is phenomenal sharpness. And then comparing, if I use the 2x extender with the 400mm, I'd pretty much need to photograph at f8 for most instances, whereas if I use the 1.4 extender on the 600mm, I found that I could pretty much shoot at f5.6 and have phenomenal sharpness. So I'm going to be adding some stops for the aperture by using the 400mm with the extenders, whereas I could just be shooting the 600mm at f4 or f5.6 with the 1.4 extender and be getting better results. So really, for my scenario and my tests, I found that the 600mm was actually better in low light for most of my uses, with the exception of using the 400mm at f2.8 wide open. So that was something interesting for me to find out. I was really expecting that the 400mm was going to be phenomenal with the extenders. Again, it could just be the lens that I'm using here to test. Your instance might be different, but in my cases, I found that the 600mm bare at f4 was sharper than the 400mm with the 1.4 extender, and the 600mm with the 1.4 extender at f5.6 was sharper than the 400mm with the 2x extender. So that's something to consider. So if I'm out in the woods and I have a subject that I need to put the extender on the 600mm, I actually have better low light capability at f5.6 than I would with using the 400mm with the 2x extender at f8. So that's actually twice the amount of light that I'm going to be getting on the 600mm with the 1.4 than the 400mm with the 2x extender. So that's something to consider, and definitely something to test when you're going through this decision yourself. Now, the best lens for you might come down to what kind of subjects you actually photograph. So for me, I spend about 75% of my time photographing birds. A lot of times they're small songbirds or they're small shorebirds. Occasionally I find owls and hawks to photograph, but still, a lot of times it is small songbirds. I love songbirds, I love birds, I love to photograph them, I love to watch them. So for me, that's a big factor for which lens works best for me. So to photograph birds, a lot of times you need that longer reach, especially for the smaller birds. So in that case, the 600mm comes in really handy because you can just use this without the extender. A lot of times you have long enough reach just with that, you get excellent image quality, and you're good to go. Whereas with the 400mm, a lot of times it's hard to get a small songbird large enough in the frame, not to fill the frame, but just large enough in the frame with just a 400mm. So a lot of times you need to use the extender, either the 1.4 or the 2x extender, just to get a similar picture that you would get with just a 600mm without the extender. So that was a big factor in my determination as well. Because when I tried to use the 400mm, I got some great environmental shots, but the bird was very small in frame, very, very small in frame. So I ended up needing to use the extender pretty much 99% of the time when I was trying to photograph birds, and the whole time I was wondering if I was using the wrong lens or not, because it just didn't make sense for me to use a lens where I needed to have an extender on all the time when I was photographing a specific kind of subject. So that was a big factor for me. It might be something for you to consider as well. Another big factor, and really important factor in my book, is how close you can actually get to your subject to photograph them. In my case, like I said before, I can't get very close to the animals to photograph them. Birds you can get pretty close to. I can get close to birds in my backyard to photograph them from my blind. I can set up the blind out in the woods and usually have a pretty good chance of getting close enough to the wildlife to photograph them. But if I'm just hiking through the woods, chances are I'm not going to be able to get very close to wildlife. So in that case, the 600mm works better in my cases because I don't need to get so close to wildlife to make them skittish, make them flee, make them aware, and really ultimately change their behavior. I can stay farther away and still be able to get some good pictures of them. Whereas the 400mm, I would need to get closer to the animal, and in that case, for me, a lot of times that meant scaring the animal or changing its behavior, which really is not my goal. And really, I think wildlife photographers should have an ethical standard that they shouldn't be changing the behavior of the wildlife they're trying to photograph. So with that being said, there were two occasions that I was hiking through the woods, and a lot of times in the forest up here, there's some dense understory. A lot of times there's mountain laurel. It's very dense. You can't see very far ahead of you. And there was two occasions when I actually got to photograph a yearling black bear that popped out of the mountain laurel about 30 yards in front of me, and I had the 400mm on my camera, and it worked out perfectly because I was at that point close enough to it and I was able to get some great pictures. But because I was close enough to it, the bear ended up fleeing a few seconds after it saw me. So it's kind of like a catch-22. Yes, it works great in some instances, but I ultimately changed the behavior of the animal, caused it to flee. So it's a hard thing to figure out which one is actually working best for you. Now, another thing you can consider is, what if you just use the 400mm at f2.8 all the time, you don't use the extenders, and instead you just crop in after you take the picture in Lightroom or whichever photo editing software you use, which you could do. When I was testing out the 400mm in my backyard photographing birds, I was getting phenomenal results at f2.8. The pictures just like popped off the page. It was amazing. But in order to get the same kind of closer portraits, I would have to crop in a lot to get the same thing as the 600mm was. And in the backyard, I was able to get closer to the birds because it's my backyard, I'm feeding them, they're used to me, so it wasn't an issue. But in the real world, in the forest, I'm just not going to be able to get that close to the species of birds that are out there unless I'm hidden in a hide or in dense camouflage. It's really just, it's not going to happen in most instances. So using the 400mm and then resulting in cropping later in post-processing, it's something you can do. I mean, my Canon R5 has a 45 megapixel camera, so the resolution on the images is phenomenal. You can crop in amazingly sharp and still get great images. But it kind of, in my opinion, is by cropping all the time in Lightroom, you're kind of removing the artistic kind of picture taking process when you're out in the field. Whereas if you just frame it as you want it with the 600mm, it just creates a better sense of actually creating a picture and having an artistic perspective of where you want to put the subject in the frame and how you want the surrounding images or the surrounding space around the subject. So that's just my 2 cents on it. So, came down to decision time. So which lens am I ultimately going to keep using? Well, it's going to be the 600mm. I went from testing the 400mm for 2.5 weeks straight, and then I just recently this week went back to using the 600mm to kind of finalize my comparison. And for me, picking up the 600mm and taking some pictures with it just kind of solidified the fact that that is the lens for me. It's the best one for my purpose. Like I said, I usually photograph birds, they're small birds, and I just need that extra reach. And the 600mm gives me that reach just straight out of the lens without using an extender, and it just creates the kind of images that I want. And I'm not really one to just do tight portraits on birds. I still like the environment, but because the 600mm gives you that reach and it can blur out a lot of the background with the wide aperture, it just creates the effect that I want. And especially for the types of pictures that I take and the kind of images that my clients want, the 600mm just works best for that purpose. Now, it really just comes down to, like I said, the style of photography that you are comfortable with and that you like, and the types of subjects that you photograph. If you are more of a kind of maybe out west, you're photographing large elk, bison, that kind of thing, the 400mm might be the best choice for you. The larger size of the animals that you're photographing allows you to be farther away from the subjects, and the 400mm will make it so you don't completely fill in the frame with them. Whereas for me, the 600mm just works best. The animals typically in this area are really far away. I can't get that close to them without them fleeing and being so skittish. So the 600mm gets me up close to those species without being too close that I alter their behavior. And using the extenders with it gets me a little bit farther reach, and it just works for my purposes. Another thing that I noticed when I was out there with the 400mm is, even though it might be on paper a more versatile lens, because you get the 400mm, you get the 560, and then you get the 800mm, you really get 3 lenses in one when you have these extenders. I found that using or having to add or remove the extenders constantly was kind of cumbersome and was really, honestly, annoying. It just felt like I should just be able to use this lens without the extenders, and in most cases that just wasn't the case, because I needed to have a little bit more reach while still being far enough away from the subject so they could continue doing what they were doing. So that's my 2 cents. I'm going to be sticking with the 600mm. I enjoy it, I love it. I would recommend it highly, especially if you photograph birds. And yeah, that's just my opinion. It could be different for you. It really depends on your style of photograph or style of photography and the subjects that you photograph. Really, if you're worried about weight or any kind of maneuverability, that kind of thing, it's really not that big of a factor. Like I said, the 400mm is a little bit easier to handhold because you can kind of bring it closer to your body, but the 600mm can easily be adapted. Once you get used to the weight, you can easily use it the same way. So that's just that's my opinion. I hope this video helped you. If you're in the same boat that I was, trying to compare and figure out which lens was going to work best for you, I hope this video kind of shed some light on some aspects that may have been lacking and really help you decide which one works best for you. If the video was helpful, please hit that thumbs up button, that like button, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And I'm going to be back out in the forest next week, where I'm going to be looking for more wildlife to photograph. I'm actually got an exciting project lined up where I'm working with a local land trust to get some footage for them. So I'm going to be back out searching for the different species, plant life and animal life that are out there in their preserves. So I'll be out there next week, and I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.